Death in video games is everywhere. It's probably the most common way to tell the player you failed. Death and game overs have also been around since video games looked like this, so there have been a lot of different takes on the idea over the years. I also wanted to talk about death in games because its influence on player behavior is criminally overlooked, and I truly believe that all the best games that implement a death mechanic in some way make inventive use of it to complement the other aspects of their game. The best games that implement death mechanics use death to enhance and complement the best parts of their game. They use it to funnel the player into playing the game in the most enjoyable way and push them towards engaging with its most refined mechanics. I think this is very well exemplified by OK Games' Celeste, a critically acclaimed indie platformer known for its tight controls and fast movement. Generally, when you die in Celeste, you go back to the start of the room you're in, losing at most 30 seconds of progress. Celeste's ideology when it comes to death is have it matter as little as possible without getting in the way of the challenge. This works really well and is especially well chosen for Celeste since the enjoyment of the game comes from the flow state of traversing its levels. I think the developers recognized that the constant flow of gameplay which makes Celeste enjoyable required players to almost always be controlling their character and structured their death system to complement it. They made it so you spend the least time possible not playing, and it's very hard to fault their reasoning behind it. Death taking a backseat like it does in Celeste tends to work really well in games where the core mechanics have some level of inherent pacing, since it doesn't interrupt the flow of movement. Resident Evil 1 is also a very good example of death complementing the best aspects of a game, but in a really different way. Death in Resident Evil 1 is balanced through saving being linked to a finite in-game resource. To save in Resident Evil 1, you need to use an item called an ink ribbon, which is a relatively rare item, of which there are only 30 in the entire game. If you use all 30 ink ribbons, you can't save. You just can't. Not a single time for the rest of the game. Wherever your last save is, you need to beat the game from there in one shot. It's brutal and honestly the most punishing way to handle death I've seen. Even roguelikes sending you all the way back to the start pale in comparison to this very crunchy looking disc in the opening door simulator. By punishing the player so heavily for saving, the game really encourages long stints of unsaved progress where death would mean having to redo a considerable amount. This greatly amps up the tension of the game even in its more mundane moments, which is excellent since as a survival horror game, tension is what it's trying to create. Despite the system eventually being phased out due to it being too punishing, it was still extremely effective at what it set out to do, and was instrumental to the atmosphere that made Resident Evil 1 so compelling. Molding player behavior is also a key purpose that death serves, and it can be the driving force behind the entire concept of a game. A great example of this would be Sifu, a martial arts action RPG with a focus on perfection. In Sifu, when you die, your character ages, making you weaker and in turn making the game considerably harder. If you die enough, you'll be sent back to the start. It's a highly punishing system that's very good for two things: rewarding perfection and punishing barely scraping through. It even adds an extra bit of difficulty on top by forcing you to start the next level at the age you beat the previous level. So if you barely manage to beat level 1 at age 70, you then have to start level 2 at age 70, meaning you only have one chance to beat it. All of this is done to push the player towards the ideal way to enjoy the game and force them to genuinely improve and perfect each level of the game before proceeding to the next one. It's an incredibly innovative use of death as a mechanic, as it completely changes the way the game is played. A very different but equally effective approach is found in games of the roguelike genre. If you aren't familiar with the roguelike or roguelite genre, it refers to games built around the core mechanic of death sending you all the way back to the start of the game. To beat the game, you need to complete it all in one go, start to finish, one perfect run. It's a really interesting idea, which is probably why it's captivated so many people. To state the obvious here, the stakes of death for a roguelike are through the roof, but because it's so all or nothing, it kind of recontextualizes the whole experience. Because it's either you beat the whole thing or go all the way back to the start, it manages to sidestep the risk-averse playstyle that high stakes often encourage, and gets the player to engage with more unfamiliar mechanics, make bolder and riskier decisions, and overall have a far fuller experience of the game. The impact on player behavior is also influenced by the genre's unusual and meta progression system. Generally, your progression in a game is very tangible and usually exists within the game in some form, whether that be items, XP, or something else. But in roguelikes, your progression generally is knowledge. Instead of progressing in a traditional way, when playing a roguelike, you progress by slowly getting further and further into the game on consecutive runs and learning about what's to come, giving you the ability to prepare in advance. It completely changes the stakes of death, since there's nothing that can really be lost when all the progress is stored in your mind. mind, and as a result, the player is more likely to experiment with new playstyles and mechanics, which gives the developers the opportunity to realize a lot of ideas that would otherwise be left out of the game, since they're confident that the player will try them out. Another heavily underrated application of death mechanics is their ability to introduce nuanced risk-reward decisions that add a lot of depth to the pre-existing gameplay loop. That was a lot of complicated words, but the gist is death force player to make hard decisions. One game that does this really well is Sakura. Wow, shocker, Reese talks about Sakura again. Who could have guessed? Sakura manages to force the player to make a really interesting risk-reward decision through the use of its death mechanics in conjunction with an item called the bundled Jizo statue. Sakura actually has a really unique way of doing death, and if you aren't familiar with it, essentially you have up to 3 revives that can be used when you die. Once you've expended all 3, you die, sending you back to where you last saved. While this on a surface level may seem quite complicated, it's actually fairly cut and dry, as the revives mostly function as more HP, but far more depth is added with the introduction of the bundled Jizo statue. The bundled Jizo statue is a really rare item in Sekiro, so rare in fact that there are only 8 obtainable throughout the entire game. When you use a Jizo statue, it restores one of your revives, and is consumed in the process. It gives the player an extra chance, but only once, which creates an interesting risk-reward decision where the player has to predict whether they'll die or not. It can be the difference between beating a boss and losing, but if you fail even after consuming the statue, it's the worst of both worlds. While it may temporarily make it harder to fully die, the potential trade-off is massive, as you'll no longer have that safety net for later and potentially harder bosses, so it's quite a balanced and interesting decision. The creation of risk-reward decisions through the use of death mechanics is actually quite common in the Souls-like genre, and it can even be found in some of the weaker Dark Souls imitations. Lords of the Fallen, for example, a AAA Souls-like that is really bad, manages to do this very effectively. Somehow between its both clunky and floaty combat, its awkward boss design, and its lack of visual style, it manages to showcase some quite interesting ideas, one of which being its approach to death and saving. In Lords of the Fallen, when you die, you drop your current XP, and when you respawn, that XP you drop begins to slowly decrease in value, so the longer you take to get back to where you died and recover it, the less of it you'll get back. This is really great for a bunch of reasons. One, it creates variable stakes for death based on distance from the last checkpoint and amount of XP on hand. 2, it forces the player to vary their playstyle, as they have to rush back to where they died and can't just play passively and methodically. And 3, it gets the player to constantly reassess the stakes of their death as they move further from the last checkpoint and accrue more XP. You might be thinking now, wouldn't this just cause the player to be ultra careful all of the time, barely fight anything that isn't required, and only take risks when a checkpoint is nearby? And yes, that would make a lot of sense, but fortunately Lords of the Fallen somehow has an answer to all of these problems, and it comes in the form of an XP multiplier. In Lords of the Fallen, additional XP is awarded to the player for the number of enemies killed before hitting a checkpoint. By some stroke of genius, this overall really mediocre to bad game has come up with a pretty watertight system that provides a very nuanced and situational risk-reward decision the player has to make. And while this may not be that useful for a game as sluggish as Lords of the Fallen, if a system like this were to be implemented in something a bit faster paced, like Bloodborne for example, it could elevate the game to new heights by bringing the tension and interactivity of more mundane sections of the game in line with that of the boss fights. This example in particular was a big inspiration for this video, since it's such an odd little spark of genius in an otherwise very mediocre game that really takes advantage of death and how it can mold player behavior. To recap, the best death systems use death to complement the best parts of their game, add depth to pre-existing mechanics, and push the player towards the most enjoyable way to play the game. Hopefully with this video I've shed some light on where death is utilized really well in video games, since I genuinely believe it's a heavily overlooked aspect of a lot of the best games. Thanks for watching.